"Stop the line," Thomas Keating said, and for 3 seconds no one moved because every screen in the factory was still green. Atlas 1 stretched beneath the glass observation deck like a machine built to prove that certainty could be engineered. 30 robotic stations moved in perfect sequence across the polished production floor, lifting electric drive assemblies, tightening housings, measuring alignment, and passing completed units toward final inspection without a single warning light. 30 engineers stood in matching white safety jackets beside 30 diagnostic screens. 200 guests waited beyond the glass. Bank representatives reviewed the final release schedule. Industry reporters adjusted their cameras. On a long table above the production floor, a silver pen rested beside a contract worth $780 million. Victoria Ashford stood 5 feet from that table with both hands loosely folded in front of her, watching the countdown clock move toward the signing ceremony. 40 minutes remained. Then Megan Brooks checked the same drive assembly twice. She was 27, new enough to the quality division that most senior engineers still explained procedures she had already memorized, and careful enough to distrust numbers that looked too clean. The first unit showed a calibration shift of 0.3 of a degree. Small. Almost dismissible. The second carried the exact same shift. So did the third. Megan moved to the next inspection terminal and pulled a sample from another section of the line. Same result. By the time she reached Unit 47, the error had not changed by a single decimal place. She looked across the production floor. 30 stations. 30 teams. One identical mistake. Preston Vale reached her before she could call the control room. He wore the expression of a man who believed urgency became less serious when spoken about quietly. "It is a display issue," he said. "The verification software is reading the reference file incorrectly." Megan turned the screen toward him. "The independent gauge agrees with it." Preston did not look at the gauge. He looked toward the observation deck, where Victoria was. Speaking with Thomas. "Run the sequence again." Megan did. The green status bar returned. The measurement did not change. Thomas came down from the deck without hurrying, carrying the unsigned acceptance folder beneath one arm. He stopped beside the inspection station and asked for 3 random assemblies from separate production intervals. The laboratory checked all 3. Each failed in the same direction. No alarm had sounded. No robot had stopped. No operator had seen anything unusual. That was what made the error dangerous. The system had not broken. It had learned to approve the wrong answer. Thomas closed the folder. "Stop the line," he repeated. This time the words traveled. Conveyor belts slowed. Robotic arms returned to neutral positions. The countdown clock continued above the silent floor. Victoria set the silver pen down. 10 minutes later, the certification team expanded the sample. The deviation appeared in every batch produced since the last master calibration. 18,000 drive assemblies were placed on hold. The bank suspended the next funding release. Thomas informed Victoria that Northline Logistics would not sign until the source was identified and independently corrected. Across the factory, 30 engineers turned toward 30 different screens. Megan remained beside the only measurement that had told the truth. On the observation deck, Victoria looked down at Atlas 1, still glowing green, and understood that the most expensive mistake in the building was not the one anyone could see. It was the one the system had been trained to call correct. 40 minutes earlier, the contract on the glass table had looked less like paper than permission. $780 million in projected revenue, 12,000 electric delivery vehicles, 3 years of manufacturing commitments, and the financing release that would keep Ashford Mobility Systems expanding through the next quarter. Victoria Ashford had reviewed every page before sunrise. She knew the delivery penalties, the certification thresholds, the labor exposure, and the exact percentage by which the company's stock was expected to rise after Thomas Keating signed. What she had not reviewed was the assumption beneath all of it, that Atlas I could be trusted because 30 specialists had approved it. From the observation deck, the factory appeared almost ceremonial. Glass walls reflected the movement of robotic arms below. White safety jackets moved between stations with the clean coordination of a rehearsed presentation. The press area had been arranged beside a scale model of the Northline fleet. Catering staff placed coffee near the back wall. A photographer tested the angle that would capture Victoria, Thomas, the contract, and the production line in a single frame. Richard Bellamy, chairman of the board, stood near the signing table speaking quietly with two bank representatives. He reminded Victoria that the next funding release depended on Northline accepting the first certified production run before noon. Without it, the company would have enough cash to operate, but not enough to continue expansion, cover the new supplier guarantees, and meet the accelerated schedule Preston had promised the board. Victoria understood the difference. Survival was not the same as control. Thomas approached the glass table and placed his acceptance folder beside the silver pen. He was 61, careful with language, and known for refusing contracts that required him to ignore what he could verify. "Your team is confident?" he asked. Victoria looked down at the line. 30 engineers signed the readiness review. Thomas followed her gaze. "That was not my question." Preston answered before she could. Atlas I has completed 6 full validation cycles without a production stop. Every station is within tolerance. Victoria noticed that he said every station. He did not say every unit. The distinction passed too quickly to become concern. At 9:17, Megan's first message appeared on the quality dashboard. Minor calibration deviation. Manual review requested. Preston cleared it as a display anomaly before the alert could rise to the executive screen. At 9:19, a second message appeared. At 9:21, Megan requested independent measurement authority. Preston approved another internal rerun instead. The green status. Bars remained unbroken. Guests continued arriving. The countdown clock moved toward 30 minutes. Victoria signed the preliminary release page and placed it beneath the final contract. Then she saw Megan leave her assigned station and walk toward another inspection terminal carrying the same drive assembly in both hands. She was not moving like someone correcting a software error. She was moving like someone protecting evidence. Thomas saw it too. He closed his folder before anyone spoke. Below them, 30 engineers began gathering around 30 different screens, each one searching for a local explanation. No one stepped back far enough to see the pattern. Victoria looked at Preston. "Why is quality repeating an independent measurement?" He adjusted his cuff and gave her the calm answer she wanted. "Because new analysts do not yet know which deviations matter." On the floor below, Megan tested the 47th unit. The number did not change. Victoria's phone vibrated with a bank confirmation awaiting release. Thomas placed one hand over the unsigned contract. Then the laboratory called the observation deck. 6 weeks earlier, the same observation deck had been quiet enough for Elliot Harper to hear the ventilation system cycle above the glass. 30 empty chairs faced a presentation screen. Victoria Ashford stood beside the conference table with Preston Vale on her right and Richard Bellamy at the far end, reading a restructuring plan that described Elliot as a key person risk. The phrase appeared 3 times in 12 pages. Elliot noticed because he had written the reliability standards that required repeated language to be treated as intentional. Preston explained that Atlas I had become too important to depend on one system's lead. He proposed replacing Elliot's centralized authority with 30 engineers divided across automation, robotics, thermal systems, software, quality assurance, and data analytics. The plan promised 18% faster calibration, reduced approval delays, and complete accountability through specialized ownership. Elliot listened without interrupting. He wore the same gray work shirt he had worn during the first commissioning run, the one with a repaired cuff and a faint oil mark near the pocket that had never fully disappeared. Victoria watched him for a reaction. He gave her none. Do you disagree with the staffing model? She asked. Elliot looked at the diagram on the screen. 30 boxes connected by clean blue lines. Each box contained a title. None contained responsibility for what happened between them. Who owns the system between departments? He asked. Preston smiled as if the question proved the problem. The system will no longer need one person to understand all of it. Elliot looked at Victoria. She had built the company through decisions that moved quickly and measured cleanly. The board had warned her that investors disliked dependence on individuals, especially individuals who declined promotions, avoided travel, and kept too much operational knowledge outside executive reporting channels. Elliot had done all three. He had also spent 4 years turning Atlas One from a collection of vendor machines into a single coordinated line. Victoria knew that. She also knew he had refused the vice president position because it required 3 weeks of travel each month. Preston had called that a lack of ambition. Elliot had called it Tuesday pickup from Sadie's school. Richard Bellamy folded his hands. This is not a termination for cause. We are offering a transition package and consulting availability. Elliot glanced at the packet in front of him. How long is the transition? 2 weeks, Preston said. The incoming team has already begun reviewing your documentation. Elliot turned one page. His name was missing from the manual index. He closed the packet. Then they should read the rollback section before changing calibration authority. Preston leaned back. That is exactly the kind of bottleneck we are removing. Elliot said nothing more. He signed the acknowledgement, not the agreement, and stood. Outside the conference room, Sadie waited on a bench with her backpack between her shoes and a small blue plastic gear in her palm. Julia had brought it home from an engineering fair years earlier, before illness reduced their family to schedules, medicine, and decisions no one was ready to make. Sadie looked at the box in her father's hands. Are you done early? She asked. Elliot looked through the glass at the 30 empty chairs. Yes. Did something break? He rested one hand on her shoulder. Not yet. Behind him, Preston entered the conference room and began placing name cards on the chairs. Elliot Harper's life did not become dramatic after Ashford Mobility removed him. It became smaller, quieter, and more exact. He woke at 5:10 every morning before Sadie's alarm, packed her lunch in the blue insulated bag Julia had bought during kindergarten, checked the weather, signed whatever school form had appeared overnight, and made coffee strong enough to last until noon. At 6:20, he drove Sadie across town in a 12-year-old pickup with one heater vent that worked better than the other. He never complained about that. He simply aimed the stronger vent toward her side. After school drop-off, he worked from a narrow garage behind a tire shop, repairing industrial controllers, electric motors, and the kinds of machines companies stopped understanding after the original technician left. The garage had one steel workbench, 2 rolling tool cabinets, and a desk where Sadie completed homework beneath a lamp with a cracked green shade. Elliot kept the space cleaner than most offices. Every cable was labeled. Every replaced component went into a clear bag with the date and reason written by hand. He charged fairly, arrived when he said he would, and never told customers that the company firing him had once trusted him with a production system worth $420 million. Sadie asked about Ashford Mobility only once during the first week. She sat on a stool near the workbench, turning the small blue plastic gear between her fingers while Elliot tested a damaged control board. Did 30 people do your job? She asked. Elliot kept one probe on the circuit and watched the reading settle. They were hired to do parts of it. Is that the same thing? He looked at her then. Only if someone still understands how the parts affect each other. Sadie considered the answer and placed the gear beside his multimeter. Julia had brought it home from an engineering fair 9 years earlier, laughing because the booth attendant had called it a stress toy and Elliot had immediately explained why the teeth were cut badly. After Julia became ill, the gear stayed on the kitchen windowsill beside appointment cards and prescription bottles. After she died, Sadie began carrying it in her pocket. Elliot had once been offered a promotion that would have required 3 weeks of travel every month. He declined before the meeting ended. Preston later described the decision as proof that Elliot lacked executive ambition. The truth was simpler. Sadie needed one parent at home, and Elliot had already learned that no title could return the hours a family lost. He chose school pickup, Tuesday dinners, and being present when nightmares came at 2 in the morning. He did not believe that choice made him less capable. He knew it made him less convenient to men who measured commitment by absence. 6 weeks after he left Ashford Mobility, Elliot was rebuilding a motor controller when a former supplier called and mentioned that Atlas One was preparing for final acceptance. Elliot thanked him for the information and returned to work. He did not search the company news. He did not contact Victoria. He did not warn anyone. Before leaving, he had documented every interlock, every rollback path, and every calibration rule clearly enough for a careful team to follow. That evening, Sadie found him closing the garage later than usual. "Do you miss it?" she asked. Elliot turned off the bench light and looked at the dark tools arranged in straight rows. "I miss the work," he said. He locked the door. Not the room. At Ashford Mobility, the 30 engineers arrived in groups large enough to look like a solution before any of them touched the system. Robotics specialists took the west stations. Software engineers occupied the glass control room. Thermal analysts claimed the calibration lab. Quality teams received new tablets, new badges, and access to documentation Preston Vale described as the most complete technical package in the company. On the first Monday, a camera crew recorded an internal video introducing the replacement team. 30 white safety jackets stood beneath the Atlas One logo while Preston spoke about modernization, redundancy, and the end of key person dependence. Behind them, the production map filled an entire screen. Every subsystem had a new owner. Every department had a leader. No one was assigned the spaces between them. Megan Brooks watched the recording from the quality office after her shift. She had joined Ashford Mobility 8 months earlier and knew enough to recognize when language had been polished more carefully than evidence. Preston called the manuals a new collaborative achievement. Yet the documents did not read as if 30 people had written them. The strongest sections carried the same rhythm throughout: short sentences, exact measurements, handwritten tolerances converted into clean tables, and warnings phrased like field experience rather than corporate policy. Never recalibrate after thermal drift. Do not restore power before verifying reference stability. A green status does not confirm a true baseline. Megan searched the index for an author. There was none. She checked an older maintenance copy stored on a local terminal. The technical content matched, but the footer had been removed. She asked the software lead who had written the rollback procedure. He said it came with the system. She asked the thermal team about the reference sensor rule. They said Preston had called it legacy wording. By the second week, the internal video played in the lobby beside investor updates. Visitors saw 30 engineers standing in front of Atlas One and assumed the system had been rebuilt by the people wearing the badges. Victoria saw the same image during an executive review and accepted it as proof that the transition had worked. Production speed increased. Approval meetings shortened. Preston reported an 11% reduction in calibration delays and predicted 18% by quarter end. Megan remained unconvinced. She began comparing archived pages with the new release. In the older versions, technical notes ended with the initials EH. In the new versions, the spacing remained, but the initials were gone. Someone had not rewritten the manual. Someone had erased the person who understood it. She saved one archived copy to an approved quality folder and printed a single page for her desk. At the bottom, beneath a thermal stabilization chart, one sentence had been highlighted in faded yellow. The master reference sensor must reach thermal equilibrium before calibration data is replicated across stations. 3 days later, Preston entered the quality office, noticed the page, and removed it from Megan's desk. That rule slows the line for no measurable benefit, he said. Megan looked at the chart. Who wrote it? Preston folded the page once. Someone who no longer works here. He dropped it into the recycling bin and walked away. Megan waited until the office emptied, retrieved the page, flattened the crease, and placed it inside her notebook. Above the factory floor, 30 new badges opened every door. Elliot's name no longer appeared on. The system still remembered him. The company had decided not to. The decision to remove the thermal weighting rule happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the Northline acceptance test, during a production meeting that lasted less than 20 minutes. Preston Vale stood at the end of the glass conference table with a chart showing calibration delays across all 30 stations. Each delay averaged 11 minutes. Multiplied across shift changes, maintenance checks, and emergency resets, the lost time looked large enough to embarrass anyone who believed speed was the same as control. Victoria Ashford studied the chart while Richard Bellamy asked how much faster Atlas 1 could run without the restriction. Preston answered before the thermal team finished reviewing the data. We can recover nearly 18% of lost calibration time. One young engineer named Daniel Price shifted in his chair. He had joined the company 2 weeks earlier and had spent most of that time reading documents Elliot Harper had written without knowing who Elliot was. The stabilization period protects the reference value, Daniel said. Preston looked at him with polite patience. It protects an assumption from an older maintenance model. Megan Brooks sat near the back with her notebook closed beneath one hand. She knew the rule did not protect an assumption. It protected the truth that every downstream station would copy. The master reference sensor was designed to establish a baseline only after its housing, internal electronics, and surrounding air reached the same temperature. If the system learned from a warm sensor, the calibration file would still look clean. It would simply be wrong. Megan asked whether they had run a controlled comparison. Preston changed the slide. A green bar showed successful replication across 30 stations. The system accepted the file, he said. That is the comparison. Victoria looked toward the production floor below. Orders were increasing. Investors wanted proof that the new team could deliver the speed Preston had promised. 11 minutes felt small until it appeared in a quarterly forecast. Remove the delay, she said. Keep the verification step. Preston nodded. Daniel did not. The verification uses the same reference, he said quietly. No one answered him. That evening, the thermal interlock was disabled under an authorized configuration update. The master sensor had been active for 47 minutes and remained several degrees above equilibrium when Preston ordered the calibration cycle. A technician hesitated with his hand above the confirmation key. Preston pointed to the schedule on the wall. Proceed. The sensor produced a stable number. The replication server copied it to every robotic station. 30 progress bars moved from left to right. 30 screens turned green. The control room applauded when the final station confirmed acceptance. Megan did not. She watched the temperature trace continue falling after the calibration file had already been approved. The baseline was not stable. It had only been captured at a convenient moment. She saved a private audit snapshot before the system overwrote the temporary record. Preston saw her at the terminal. You are creating noise around a solved problem, he said. Megan closed the file. A solved problem should not keep changing after approval. Preston looked toward the green screens. Results are what matter. Below them, Atlas 1 began producing drive assemblies against the new baseline. The robots moved correctly. The software followed every command. The inspection system compared each unit to the same flawed reference and approved it. Nothing sparked. Nothing stopped. Nothing sounded wrong. The most expensive mistake in the factory entered production without making a sound. Megan Brooks found the first false green at 6:43 the next morning, before most of the engineering team arrived and before the factory lights had fully shifted from night mode to production white. Atlas 1 was already running its first batch. Robotic arms moved with measured precision, conveyors advanced on schedule, and every inspection screen showed the same calm green status. Megan stood alone at Quality Station 12 with a drive assembly clamped beneath an independent gauge. The torque curve looked perfect. Too perfect. Real production carried variation, even in tightly controlled systems. Bearings settled differently. Fasteners responded to surface temperature. Materials flexed by fractions no software could eliminate completely. Yet the last 20 assemblies matched one another to the third decimal place. She checked the gauge calibration. Correct. She moved the same unit to another bench and used a separate instrument. The deviation remained. Then she pulled data from stations 4, 11, 19, and 27. Different robots. Different operators. Different production intervals. The measurements were identical in the same wrong direction. Megan opened the audit snapshot she had saved the night Preston disabled the thermal interlock. The master sensor temperature had continued falling for 19 minutes after the baseline file was created. The copied value had not been false because the sensor malfunctioned. It had been false because they asked it the right question at the wrong time. Daniel Price arrived carrying coffee and stopped when he saw the 5 screens open across Megan's station. "What did you find?" he asked. Megan pointed to the matching curves. 30 independent stations should not make the same mistake this cleanly. Daniel set the coffee down. Unless they all learned from the same reference. They tested 3 more assemblies. Then 6. Every result matched. Megan sent an escalation request to Preston with the raw measurements attached. He arrived 11 minutes later, still fastening the cuff of his white safety jacket. He studied the screens without sitting. "The improved process has reduced variation," he said. "This is what consistency looks like." Megan moved the independent gauge toward him. "Consistency does not erase physical tolerance." Preston looked at Daniel. "Have you verified her equipment?" Daniel answered carefully. "The equipment agrees with the external lab standard." Preston's expression remained calm. "Then quality needs to update the acceptance band." Megan closed one data window and opened the archived thermal chart. "The acceptance band is not the problem. The baseline moved." Preston's eyes stopped on the saved snapshot. For the first time, his attention shifted away from the numbers and toward how she had obtained them. That file should have been overwritten. Megan did not answer. He reached for the keyboard, but she moved the tablet closer to herself. "I preserved it under quality authority." Preston lowered his hand. "You are holding production over a theoretical concern." "No," Megan said. "Production is moving because the system cannot recognize the concern." He looked through the glass at Atlas 1, where another assembly passed final inspection and received a green status. "Do not stop the line without executive approval." Megan watched the unit roll toward shipping certification. "Then give me approval to test one outside the system." Preston turned away. "We do not have time to create a problem before the acceptance event." After he left, Daniel looked at the rows of green indicators. Megan opened a private audit folder and saved every measurement. By noon, 47 units had been tested. 47 carried the same deviation. The factory had not achieved perfect consistency. It had achieved perfect agreement with the wrong truth. At 9:17 on the morning of the Northline acceptance event, Megan Brooks carried the first independently. Measured drive assembly across the production floor while 200 guests watched Atlas 1 perform behind the glass. The factory had been polished for cameras. Fresh safety lines marked the concrete. White jackets moved between stations. A countdown above the observation deck showed 40 minutes until signing. Victoria Ashford stood beside the glass table with Thomas Keating, Richard Bellamy, and 3 bank representatives while Preston Vale described the line as the most advanced manufacturing system in the region. Below them, Megan reached quality station 24 and tested the assembly again. The gauge settled 0.3 of a degree outside the required alignment tolerance. The green status on the factory screen did not change. She requested a second sample from a different production hour. Same deviation. Then a third. Same direction. Daniel Price joined her with the private audit copy stored on an isolated tablet. He compared the baseline timestamp to the master sensor temperature curve. The calibration file had been created while the sensor was still cooling. Megan sent an immediate stop recommendation to executive control. Preston cleared it before the message reached Victoria. He came down from the observation deck and positioned himself between Megan and the nearest camera crew. "Return to your assigned station," he said. Megan held out the independent gauge. "The line is approving units that do not meet the customer specification." Preston kept his voice low. "You have one instrument against 30 stations. I have 47 units against one false reference." Thomas had followed them onto the floor. He did not ask Preston for an explanation. He asked the laboratory to select 10 assemblies at random from separate production batches. The samples arrived in numbered carts. One by one, the technicians measured them with equipment that had never been connected to Atlas 1. The first failed. The second failed by the same amount. By the 10th, no one near the inspection area was speaking. Above them, the countdown continued. Victoria descended from the observation deck, the silver signing pen still in her hand. How many units were produced? After the last calibration? Megan checked the traceability record. 18,216. Preston stepped forward. That does not mean 18,000 units are defective. We need time to determine the scope. Thomas closed the acceptance folder. You had 3 weeks to determine the scope. He turned toward the control room. Stop the line. Conveyor belts slowed in sequence. Robotic arms returned to neutral positions. The machinery became quiet enough for the ventilation system to be heard above the crowd. A bank representative received a message, read it, and looked toward Richard Bellamy. The next funding release had been suspended pending independent review. Reporters lowered their cameras, uncertain whether they were still attending a signing or witnessing its failure. Victoria looked across the floor at 30 engineers opening 30 separate diagnostic windows. Robotics blamed the verification software. Software blamed sensor mapping. Thermal specialists questioned the lab instruments. Quality reviewed acceptance limits. Each team moved quickly. No one moved together. Megan opened Elliot Harper's archived manual and placed the faded thermal stabilization page beside the failed measurements. His initials remained in the metadata even though his name had been removed from the document. Victoria saw them. Who wrote this procedure? She asked. Preston answered too slowly. Megan looked directly at her. The man you replaced. Victoria Ashford looked at the initials on the archived procedure, then at the 30 engineers scattered across the silent production floor. Call him, she said. Preston Vale answered before Megan could move. Elliot Harper no longer has access authority, current system clearance, or contractual responsibility for Atlas 1. Victoria kept her eyes on the page. That was not the instruction. Megan opened the employee archive and found Elliot's old contact record. The company number had been disconnected. The emergency consulting line redirected to legal. She searched the technical transition file and found one personal number listed beneath a clause requiring 2 weeks of post-employment availability. Preston reached across the workstation and closed the window. Bringing him back now would create liability. We do not know whether his old procedures caused the failure. Megan placed her hand beside the faded thermal chart. His procedure is the only reason we know where to look. Preston lowered his voice. You are not qualified to make that judgment. Thomas Keating stood several feet away with the unsigned acceptance folder beneath one arm. Then perhaps one of the 30 qualified people can explain why every unit is wrong in the same direction. No one answered. Victoria looked toward the control room, where engineering leads had opened separate diagnostic sessions and begun requesting more time. The countdown above the observation deck had been stopped, but the clock in the contract room continued. The bank's suspension notice remained on Richard Bellamy's phone. 18,000 assemblies sat in inventory with green inspection records and no valid certification. Victoria understood that calling Elliot would not erase the decision she had made 6 weeks earlier. It would only make the decision visible. "Give me the number," she said. Megan wrote it on a blank card. Preston took one step closer. "Victoria, he will use this to renegotiate everything." She finally looked at him. "If he can identify what 30 engineers cannot, then we have already negotiated from the wrong position." Megan dialed from the quality desk. The call rang 4 times. In a narrow garage across town, Elliot Harper was standing over an industrial motor controller while Sadie completed a spelling worksheet beneath the green desk lamp. His phone vibrated beside a tray of labeled components. He saw the Ashford mobility number and let it ring once more before answering. Elliot Harper. Megan identified herself and told him Atlas 1 had been stopped after a repeated calibration deviation. Elliot did not ask how much money was at risk. He asked 3 questions. When was the master file created? Was the reference sensor at equilibrium? Did anyone preserve the original audit log? Megan looked at the timestamp, the thermal curve, and the private copy on her tablet. The file was created while the sensor was still cooling. The interlock was removed. I preserved the audit. Elliot became quiet. Sadie looked up from her worksheet. On the factory floor, Victoria waited beside Megan, close enough to hear his breathing through the speaker. Preston watched the 30 green screens as if one of them might still offer a different answer. Elliot spoke again. Do not restart the line. Do not overwrite the replication server. Isolate the master sensor and keep the current state exactly as it is. Victoria leaned toward the phone. Can you come in? There was a pause long enough to remind everyone listening that he no longer owed the company anything. Elliot looked at Sadie, then at the clock above his workbench. The neighbor who usually watched her was out of town. He closed the motor controller case and wiped his hands on a shop towel. I will be there in 20 minutes, he said. My daughter is coming with me. Victoria answered without hesitation. Bring her.